28 men who owned their own trucks sued to get their seniority back. Some had hauled for the same carrier since 1937. The contract that put them at the bottom of the list was signed by their own union. The carrier was Akers Motor Lines, a North Carolina outfit that grew up on the freight that built motor carriage across that part of the country. Yarn and mill goods coming out of textile country. That was one of trucking's real advantages in the 1930s and 40s. A truck could run door to door and leave when the load was ready. Rail freight moved through terminals, interchanges, and a schedule nobody at the mill controlled. Akers followed a model a lot of carriers used in those years. It didn't buy all of its own equipment. It leased it from the men who drove it. There was nothing shady in that. It was how a motor carrier grew faster than its bank account allowed. Freight came in waves, and a fleet sized for the peak sat idle in the valley. Leasing let a carrier add capacity without signing for iron it might not need in 18 months, and it moved the cost of every overhaul, every set of tires, and every hour of downtime onto the man whose name was on the title. Understand what that meant to the man doing it. He bought the tractor. He carried the note. He paid for fuel, tires, brake work, and every Sunday he spent underneath it in a gravel lot, instead of in a chair. When something let go on the road, it was his problem and his money. He fixed it, or he didn't run. What he got back was the difference between selling his hours and owning the thing that made the money. The company driver took a rate and went home. The owner-operator took what was left after the truck was paid for, and in a good year, that was more. The men who made that trade saw themselves as something apart from the driver in the company truck. They owned the equipment, they maintained it, and they carried a risk nobody else on that payroll carried. Some of them had been carrying it at Akers since the 1930s. Through the war, through the rationing, through every lean year the freight ran thin. The 1952 contract carried a sentence that would eventually cost them everything. An owner or part owner of equipment could under no circumstances hold company seniority. Most of them knew it was in there. Several had copies of the contract. They knew owner-operators weren't carried on the driver seniority roster, and they let it ride because they believed the roster would be waiting for them if they ever came back to company equipment. Nobody ever put that part in writing. For a while it didn't matter. The men were making money with their own trucks, and company seniority was the system that governed everybody else. Then came the 1955 negotiation. Akers and similar carriers objected to writing a provision covering rentals for leased equipment into the new agreement. During the bargaining, James R. Hoffa, a member of the union's negotiating committee, said the provision was going into the contract regardless of the objections. It went in as Article 28. He wouldn't take the presidency of the International for another 2 years. He didn't need the title to be in the room where that one got settled. Article 28 did not outlaw the owner-operator. That is the part that gets told wrong. It set what a carrier had to pay to run leased equipment, and the added expense was enough that Akers stopped using leased equipment. Not trimmed it, stopped. All of it but one. That left men holding trucks they had bought and maintained with no Akers lease to pull under. A man could go looking for another carrier, or he could leave the truck behind and come back to Akers as a company driver. A lot of them came back. And the seniority they had assumed was waiting for them wasn't. Under the 1955 contract, their driver seniority was dated September 1st, 1955, no matter how many years they had already given the company. Not 1937, not 1941, not 1944. September 1st, 1955, same as a man hired that morning off the street. If you never worked under a seniority list, that sounds like bookkeeping. It isn't. The list decides which truck a man gets and which runs he can bid. And when the freight drops, it decides who keeps working and who sits home. It is the closest thing to protection a driver can build, and he builds it only by staying put. They had built it. They had just been told the clock started over. Akers had 424 over-the-road drivers on June 1st, 1956. A year later, it had 360. 64 positions gone in 12 months, and furloughs came off the list from the bottom up. Men who had been on that property for 18 years were sitting in last place watching the number shrink toward them. That is a slow kind of dread. Nobody fires you. You just do the arithmetic every quarter on where you sit. So 28 of them sued. Here is the first thing that doesn't fit the version of the 1950s everybody repeats. The defendant wasn't Akers. It was Local 71, their own union. Akers intervened in the case, stating that it had no objection to the relief the men were asking for and would comply with whatever the court ordered. The employer sided with the drivers. A jury was handed one compound question: had the union acted arbitrarily, discriminately, in bad faith, or in reckless disregard of these men's rights? The jury answered yes. The trial court ordered the union to revise the driver seniority list and credit each man from the date of his last continuous employment. They won. Then, on April 6, 1960, the North Carolina Supreme Court reversed it. Gainey versus Local 71. The court held that the 1955 contract deprived them of no seniority because the earlier contracts had already denied company seniority to owner-operators. For the men who had once been company drivers, the loss happened when they became owner-operators, not when Article 28 went into the contract, not when the leases ended, back when they went out on their own. Read that again, because it is the whole thing. The jury's finding didn't matter. Whether the union acted in bad faith didn't matter. You cannot lose what the contract already said you never had. The thing that was supposed to make a man independent is the thing the court used to explain why he had no claim. Ownership wasn't leverage. Under those contracts, it was a disqualification from company seniority, and it had been sitting in writing the entire time they hauled freight and assumed otherwise. The record also shows what kind of membership these men held. They were union members and they paid dues the whole way through. One of them testified that he was not permitted to vote at union meetings. They funded the organization whose negotiators wrote the clause and had next to nothing to say about the bargaining that produced it. 28 men filed. Before it reached the Supreme Court, 7 removed themselves as plaintiffs because they were no longer Akers employees. 21 names were left on a case they lost. And then there is the one lease that stayed. When Akers cut off outside equipment over the expense, it cut all of it but one, and the opinion states that in the flattest way available, sitting in the middle of the facts, in the language of 1960, except in the instance of a Negro owner-operator called Big Major, an employee of long years. Lowercase, exactly like that. No first name, no last name. The opinion offers no explanation for why Akers kept running his equipment, and it goes straight back to the seniority list. A man who identifies himself as Big Major's grandson left an account of him in a comment on this channel. He says Big Major was one of the few black owner-operators working in that era, and that he kept running from the 40s into the early 1970s. That is family testimony, not court record, and it should be weighed that way. The record does support part of the timeline. The evidence showed that Akers had owner-operators before Local 71 organized the place, which the court put at about 17 years before trial, roughly 1940. Men were running their own trucks under the Akers name before the union ever arrived. The opinion doesn't fix a starting date, but it doesn't leave much room for a later one. If the family account holds, the one man whose lease survived 1955 was still pulling long after the contract, the lawsuit, and the reversal were finished. 21 men went to court to get back what owning a truck had cost them, and the court told them they had paid it willingly. One man kept his truck.